Hey guys, tonight we're stepping into the pre-dawn darkness of a Mughal palace kitchen in the year 1658, where you can already smell the faint trace of yesterday's saffron clinging to the stone walls. And somewhere in the shadowed corridors beyond, 300 clay pots are being scrubbed clean by hands that have performed this same task for 20 years. You're standing in the matbakh-e-kaz, the specialized kitchen reserved exclusively for the emperor's personal meals, and it's 4 in the morning. The head cook, a man named Hakim Ali, who earned his position not through family connections, but through an exhaustive examination of his ability to detect spoiled ghee by smell alone, is conducting the morning inventory. This is not a quick affair. This is not a matter of glancing at shelves and making estimates. This is a precise, methodical accounting of every ingredient that will pass through this kitchen today, and it will take until sunrise to complete. Hakim Ali moves through the storage chambers with a wooden board and a piece of charcoal, marking quantities in a script that combines Persian numerals with his own invented shorthand. He's checking the rice first, always the rice first, because rice is the foundation of the Mughal court's culinary identity, and any deficiency in its quality or quantity represents not just a logistical failure, but a potential political disaster. The empire's relationship with rice is complicated, you see. Rice is not native to the arid regions around Agra and Delhi. It must be transported from Bengal, from the deltaic regions where water and earth create the perfect conditions for cultivation. And this transportation represents a massive expenditure of resources and coordination. In the grain storage room, which is kept deliberately cool through an ingenious system of ventilation shafts that draw air across underground water channels, there are currently 42 varieties of rice. This is not an exaggeration recorded by overzealous chroniclers. This is documented in the administrative records of the Mughal household department, records that still exist in fragmentary form, meticulously noting not just the varieties, but their specific origins, their ideal cooking times, and their appropriate culinary applications. There's the basmati from the foothills of the Himalayas, aged for exactly 2 years, because younger rice breaks during cooking and older rice loses its fragrance. There's the Gobindabhog from Bengal, short-grained and aromatic, reserved specifically for sweet preparations because its natural sugars caramelize beautifully. There's the Kalajira, tiny black grains that the emperor favors for their nutty flavor, and the Zira rice, long-grained and delicate, used for the most refined pulaus where each grain must remain separate and distinct. Hakim Ali runs his hands through a basket of basmati, letting the grains fall between his fingers, checking for moisture content by feel. Too dry, and the rice will shatter during washing. Too moist, and it will spoil before it can be used. He's looking for that perfect intermediate state, where the grain has hardened enough to withstand cooking, but retains enough internal moisture to bloom properly when exposed to steam. This is knowledge that cannot be written down in any meaningful way. This is knowledge that lives in the hands, passed from master to apprentice through years of daily practice. Next comes the inspection of the spices, and this is where the morning inventory becomes almost meditative in its intensity. The spice chamber is guarded by a separate servant whose only job is to maintain the security and organization of these precious commodities. Some of these spices have traveled further than most people will travel in their entire lives. The cloves come from the Malaccas, transported across the Indian Ocean by Arab traders who guard the secret of their origin with deliberate misinformation. The cinnamon comes from Ceylon, where Dutch merchants are increasingly controlling the supply and driving prices upward. The black pepper comes from the Malabar coast, where the Portuguese once held monopolies that they enforced with naval violence. But it's the saffron that receives the most scrutiny. Saffron is more valuable than gold by weight, and it's also more easily adulterated. Hakim Ali examines the deep red threads under lamplight, checking for the telltale signs of fakery. Too much yellow at the base of the thread indicates older, lower quality material. Too uniform a color suggests dyeing. Any presence of calendula or turmeric powder mixed in becomes obvious when you know what to look for. He's checking specifically for Kashmiri saffron, which the court considers superior to Persian varieties, though this preference is as much about political symbolism as about actual flavor. Using Kashmiri saffron is a statement that the Mughal Empire controls and values its own territories, that it doesn't need to depend on foreign imports for its most luxurious ingredients. The inventory continues through cardamom pods from the Western Ghats, where the green hills produce a cardamom that's more intensely aromatic than varieties from other regions, through mace and nutmeg, which come as matched pairs from the same fruit, transported carefully to prevent the volatile oils from evaporating during the long journey from Southeast Asia. Through dried rose petals, which are not technically spices, but are essential for the scented rice preparations that the emperor particularly favors. These roses come from specific gardens around Agra, where the soil composition and irrigation methods produce flowers with the ideal balance of fragrance and color retention when dried. By the time Hakim Ali moves to the fresh ingredients section, the first hints of dawn are visible through the high windows. Here, the inspection becomes more urgent because freshness is measured in hours, not days. The servants who procure vegetables and herbs for the imperial kitchen begin their work at midnight, moving through markets and making arrangements with farmers who harvest specifically for the palace. The greens must be morning fresh, cut after the dew has dried, but before the heat of the day begins to wilt them. The herbs must be so recently picked that they're still releasing their oils when you brush against them. There are bundles of cilantro, its roots still attached and cleaned meticulously of soil. There are fresh curry leaves from the southern provinces, transported in damp cloth to keep them from drying out. Their pungent citrus meets anise fragrance filling the storage area. There are fresh fenugreek greens, bitter and pungent, used in breads and vegetable preparations. There are bundles of mint in 3 varieties, each with slightly different applications. One for chutneys, one for raiters, one for direct garnish. The meat inspection happens in a separate area, because the Mughal court maintains strict rules about separating vegetarian and non-vegetarian preparation spaces. Not for religious reasons. The Mughal emperors are Muslim and have no prohibition against meat, but for practical reasons of taste and smell. The aromatic rice preparations that define Mughal cuisine cannot be contaminated by the smell of raw meat, so the processing happens in different buildings entirely. But Hakim Ali still reviews the day's meat provisions because he needs to coordinate timing with the meat kitchen. Today's menu includes a complex lamb pulao that will require 6 hours of preparation, beginning with the breaking down of a whole lamb, separating it into precisely defined cuts, each designated for different preparations. The tenderest meat from the leg will be cut into small pieces for the pulao itself. The tougher cuts will go into a slow-cooked curry that will simmer for the entire day. The bones will be roasted and then boiled for stock, which will become the cooking liquid for the rice, infusing it with deep, meaty flavor without making it heavy. As the sun finally breaks over the palace walls, casting long shadows across the kitchen courtyard, Hakim Ali completes his inventory. He's found 2 shortages. The dried rose petals are running lower than expected, which means sending an urgent message to the royal gardens to increase their drying operations, and one variety of rice, a specialty grain from Assam that the emperor occasionally requests, is completely depleted, which means a messenger will need to be dispatched today to arrange a new shipment, a process that will take weeks to complete. But these are minor issues, easily addressed. The morning inventory is complete, and now the real work can begin. Behind Hakim Ali, the kitchen is coming to life. Servants are arriving in groups, each group specialized in their particular tasks. There are the rice washers, who will spend the next hour repeatedly rinsing grain until the water runs absolutely clear. There are the spice grinders, who work with heavy stone mortars, producing pastes and powders to exact specifications. There are the fire tenders, whose job is to maintain dozens of cooking fires at different temperatures throughout the day, adding fuel at precise intervals to keep the heat steady and consistent. And somewhere in the administrative offices of the palace, a clerk is recording Hakim Ali's inventory report, adding it to the massive archives of household records that document every detail of imperial life. These records, boring and repetitive and seemingly insignificant, are actually capturing something remarkable: the extraordinary organizational complexity required to maintain the fiction of imperial effortless abundance, the hidden infrastructure of labor and expertise that allows an emperor to eat scented rice without ever considering the hundreds of decisions and the coordination of dozens of specialists that made that rice possible. But there's something that the inventory hasn't captured, something that the administrative records don't know how to document: the accumulated knowledge that exists only in practice, only in the daily repetition of tasks that look simple but contain depths of expertise. How does Hakim Ali know that this particular batch of basmati will need 3 minutes less cooking time than the last batch? How does he know that today's rose petals, though they smell identical to last week's, will actually impart a slightly different flavor because they were harvested during a different phase of the moon? How does he anticipate problems that haven't yet occurred, adjusting preparations based on subtle changes in temperature or humidity that he can't articulate but somehow feels? These questions don't have satisfying answers, and perhaps that's what makes them interesting. The Mughal kitchen operates at a level of sophistication that seems almost impossible to maintain, and yet it does maintain it, day after day, meal after meal, creating dishes that contemporary observers describe with an almost religious awe. But what does that sophistication actually look like in practice? What does it mean to be one of 800 cooks working in a system so complex that no single person understands all of it, where your expertise is so specialized that you might spend your entire career perfecting just one aspect of one type of preparation? The kitchen complex that serves Emperor Aurangzeb's court in 1658 is not a single room, but a sprawling architectural system spread across nearly 3 acres of the palace grounds, and if you were to draw a map of it, you would discover that its organization reflects not just culinary logic, but the rigid social hierarchies that structure every aspect of Mughal court life. You're following a young assistant cook named Rahim through the morning routines, and the first thing you notice is that he never walks in a straight line. He's constantly adjusting his path, taking seemingly inefficient routes that add minutes to simple journeys between buildings. And this is because the kitchen complex has invisible boundaries that are more real than walls. Certain pathways are reserved for senior cooks. Certain doorways can only be used by specific ranks of servants. There are areas where Rahim, despite working in these kitchens for 7 years, has never been permitted to enter. And there are preparations he has never been allowed to touch, not because he lacks the skill, but because he hasn't yet been granted the social permission. The kitchen hierarchy is extraordinarily precise, documented in the palace administrative manuals with the same detail given to military ranks or court positions. At the top is the Mir Bakawal, the superintendent of the kitchen, a position that comes with its own staff, its own budget, and direct access to the emperor. Below him are the separate superintendents for different types of cooking. One for meat preparations, one for breads, one for sweets, one for drinks, and one, considered the most prestigious, for rice and pulao preparations. This last position is currently held by a man named Ustad Mahmud, who earned his title Ustad, meaning master, through 40 years of work that began when he was brought to the palace at age 9 as an apprentice rice washer. Below the superintendents are the head cooks for specific dishes or techniques. There's a head cook whose only responsibility is the proper preparation of biryani, which is different from pulao in ways that inspire surprisingly heated debates among kitchen staff. There's a head cook who specializes in korma, the slow-cooked meat dishes that require constant attention and precise heat control. There's a head cook whose entire career has been devoted to the preparation of halwa, the sweet preparations that close every formal meal, and who can lecture for hours on the exact temperature at which sugar syrup reaches different stages of crystallization. Rahim himself occupies a middle position in this hierarchy. He's no longer a basic assistant, no longer assigned to washing or grinding or fire tending. He's been elevated to the position of rice cooker, which sounds simple, but represents years of training. His specific responsibility is the cooking of plain rice. Not pulao, not biryani, but the simple steamed rice that accompanies certain dishes and that must be cooked to absolute perfection because there's nowhere to hide mistakes. Every grain must be separate, fully cooked, but not mushy, and the entire batch must be ready at precisely the moment it's needed, neither early enough to begin drying out, nor late enough to delay the meal. Today, Rahim is working with the morning's first batch of rice, a variety called dud kalam, literally milk grain, named for its white color and creamy texture when properly cooked. He begins with the washing, a process that requires changing the water 7 times. Not 6, not 8, 7 specifically, because this is the number that the kitchen has determined removes the excess starch without stripping away the flavor compounds that give the rice its character. Each washing involves gentle agitation, rubbing the grains between his palms, feeling for the texture change as the starch is released. The water starts cloudy white, almost opaque, and gradually becomes clearer with each change, until by the 7th washing it's only slightly milky, still carrying some starch, but not enough to make the cooked rice sticky. After washing comes soaking, and this is where Rahim's training becomes crucial. The soaking time for rice varies based on a complex calculation involving the age of the grain, the variety, the current temperature and humidity, and the intended cooking method. Today's dud kalam, aged 18 months and measured at mid-morning humidity, requires exactly 23 minutes of soaking. Not 20, not 25, 23. Rahim knows this not through written instruction, but through apprenticeship, through standing beside senior cooks for years, learning to recognize the subtle signs that indicate proper hydration. The grains should be visibly swollen, but not beginning to split. They should be firm enough to resist light pressure, but not so hard that they'd crack if bitten. While the rice soaks, Rahim prepares his cooking station. He's using a deg, a wide, shallow cooking vessel made of copper, tinned on the inside to prevent reactions with the rice. The deg has been assigned to him specifically, and he's responsible for its maintenance. Every evening after cooking, he scrubs it with ash and lemon juice, keeping the copper bright and the tinning intact. Any discoloration, any hint of wear in the tinning, and the deg must be sent for repair immediately, because cooking in damaged vessels can affect the taste and color of the rice. The cooking method Rahim uses is called dum, which means breath or steam, and it's more complex than simply boiling rice in water. First, he brings water to a rapid boil in the deg, water that's been precisely measured by volume against the weight of the rice, a ratio that varies by variety, but for Dood Kalam is exactly 1 3/4 parts water to 1 part rice. Into this boiling water goes salt, measured by hand in a quantity that Rahim has internalized through repetition, enough to season the rice without making it taste salty. Some cooks add whole spices at this stage, a few cloves, a piece of cinnamon, some cardamom pods, but for plain rice, Rahim adds nothing, because the goal is to taste the rice itself, not to mask it with other flavors. The soaked rice goes into the boiling water all at once, and for the next 4 minutes, Rahim does nothing but watch. He's watching for the moment when the rice has absorbed enough water to be almost cooked, but not quite, when the grains have swollen to their full size, but still have a slight resistance at their core. This moment is called half-cooked in the kitchen's technical vocabulary, and recognizing it requires experience that can't be adequately described in words. The rice looks different. The grains become more opaque, less translucent, but it's a subtle difference that's easy to miss if you don't know what you're looking for. The moment arrives, and Rahim moves quickly. He drains the rice through a cloth-lined strainer, saving the starchy cooking water for other uses. Nothing is wasted in a kitchen this size. The half-cooked rice goes back into the cleaned deg, and now begins the dum process proper. Rahim spreads the rice evenly in the vessel, creating a level surface. He covers it with a cloth, then places a heavy lid on top, and then, this is the crucial step, he seals the edges of the lid with a paste made from flour and water, creating an airtight seal that will trap all the steam inside. The deg goes on to a low fire, but this is not the same fire it was cooked on initially. This is a fire that's been burning for hours, that's been reduced to glowing coals, covered with a thin layer of ash, producing steady, gentle heat. Rahim places the deg on this fire, and then does something that seems counterintuitive. He places more coals on top of the lid, creating heat from above as well as below. This dual heating is essential to the dum method. The rice needs to cook evenly throughout, and with heat only from below, the bottom layer would overcook, while the top remained underdone. Now comes the hardest part of Rahim's job: waiting. The rice will cook by trapped steam for exactly 12 minutes, and during this time, Rahim cannot check it. Opening the lid would release the steam and ruin the entire batch. He cannot stir it, or adjust it, or confirm that it's cooking properly. He can only trust his preparation, trust the process, and watch the time. In a kitchen without clocks, time is measured by water vessels, a small pot with a precise hole in the bottom placed in a larger vessel of water. As the water drips out of the small pot, it marks the passage of minutes with remarkable accuracy, and Rahim watches this water clock with the intensity of someone whose reputation depends on it, because it does. While Rahim's rice steams, the kitchen around him has reached full operational intensity. In the pulao section, which occupies an entire building separate from the plain rice cooking area, 5 different elaborate rice dishes are being prepared simultaneously, each one requiring multiple cooks working in coordination. There's a lamb pulao that began cooking 2 hours ago, the meat having been marinated overnight in yogurt and spices, then cooked slowly until it's tender enough to shred with a fork. The rice for this pulao has been partially cooked separately, then layered with the meat in a huge deg, each layer sprinkled with fried onions, fresh herbs, and drops of saffron water, creating alternating strata of white and golden rice that will be revealed when the dish is finally served. In another section, cooks are preparing a sweet pulao called zada, colored bright yellow with turmeric and studded with dried fruits and nuts. This dish walks a fine line between savory and sweet, containing sugar but also salt, cardamom but also black pepper, and it's served as a palate cleanser between richer dishes. The technique for zada is completely different from meat pulao, requiring the rice to be cooked almost to completion in sweetened water before being finished with dum. And the sugar content changes the texture entirely, making the grains slightly sticky and glossy. There's a kitchen specializing in breads, where a team of nanbais, bread bakers, work in front of tandoor ovens that have been heating since before dawn. These tandoors are sunken pits lined with clay, heated to temperatures so intense that a piece of paper held near the opening would burst into flame. The nanbais are making naan, the leavened flatbread that accompanies many dishes, and also rumali roti, unleavened bread so thin it's named handkerchief bread, stretched until it's almost transparent and cooked on an inverted curved griddle that requires constant rotation to prevent burning. Rahim's water clock has almost emptied. He removes the coals from the top of his deg, then carefully breaks the flour seal around the lid with a knife. The moment the seal breaks, steam escapes with a rush of rice fragrance, clean and simple and perfect. He lifts the lid completely, and the rice inside is exactly as it should be. Every grain separate, no clumping, no mushiness, no undercooked centers. He tests a grain between his fingers, feeling it give way with just the right amount of resistance, then tastes it to confirm what his fingers already told him. Perfect. But there's no time to celebrate this small success, because Rahim's next batch is already soaking, a different variety that will require different timing. And the batch after that is a more complex preparation, a rice that will be flavored with whole spices that need to be fried in ghee first, releasing their essential oils before the rice goes in. His work continues through the morning, through the midday heat when the kitchen becomes almost unbearable, through the afternoon when preparation begins for the evening meal, which is always more elaborate than the morning meal, requiring even more coordination and precision. And somewhere in this vast system of specialized labor, someone is doing something that no one else in the kitchen can quite replicate, some technique or touch that represents the extreme endpoint of specialization. Perhaps it's the cook who determines the exact moment when ghee has reached the perfect temperature for frying spices, a moment that comes and goes in seconds and can only be judged by the sound the spices make when they hit the fat. Perhaps it's the servant who selects rose petals for drying, choosing only the ones at peak fragrance, rejecting hundreds for every handful that meets the standard. Perhaps it's someone whose job is so specific, so narrowly defined that even describing it sounds absurd, and yet that job is essential, irreplaceable, the linchpin that holds some small piece of this vast operation together. But here's what's remarkable, and also slightly unsettling, about the Mughal kitchen system. Its incredible efficiency depends on people knowing only their small piece of it, on Rahim being an absolute master of rice cooking, but perhaps never learning the full techniques of pulao, on the pulao specialists never needing to understand bread baking, on the bread bakers never mastering sweets. The system works because of specialization, but that specialization also means that no one, not even the Mir Bakawal, fully understands everything that happens in these kitchens. The knowledge is distributed, fragmented, held in pieces by hundreds of individuals who together create something that none of them could create alone. And if you were to ask Rahim whether he ever feels limited by his specialization, whether he ever wishes he could learn other techniques or work in other sections, he might give you a look of genuine confusion, because the question itself suggests a mindset that doesn't match the reality of palace service. Rahim's identity, his social position, his sense of accomplishment all come from his mastery of his specific role. The idea of wanting to do something else, of wanting to be something other than an excellent rice cooker, wouldn't occur to him as a natural aspiration. His world is rice, and rice is his world, and within that narrow domain, he has found depths that could occupy a lifetime of study. But what happens when the system changes? What happens when the empire that supports this elaborate infrastructure begins to weaken? When the resources that fund 800 kitchen workers become harder to maintain? When the next generation decides that perhaps such extreme specialization is wasteful rather than admirable? What happens to all this accumulated knowledge, these thousands of small techniques and insights that exist only in practice, only in the daily work of people whose names are rarely recorded in the histories that focus on emperors and battles and political intrigue? You're standing in the same kitchen complex 30 years later, in the year 1688, and something has changed in ways that are difficult to articulate but impossible to ignore. The buildings are the same. The tandoors still burn with the same intensity. The storage chambers still hold dozens of varieties of rice. But there's a quality to the work that has shifted, a sense that the kitchen is performing a memory of itself rather than fully inhabiting its purpose. Rahim is still here, no longer a middle-ranked rice cooker, but now a senior instructor, responsible for training the newest generation of kitchen workers. He's 53 years old, his hands scarred from decades of work with hot vessels and sharp knives, his sense of smell still acute despite years of exposure to intense spices and smoke. He's teaching a boy named Akbar, no relation to the great emperor of that name, the fundamentals of rice preparation, and he's discovering that teaching is harder than he anticipated, because the things he knows most deeply are the things he finds most difficult to explain. "Watch the water," Rahim says, as Akbar washes rice for the third time. But the instruction is inadequate, because what Rahim means by watch involves a kind of attention that goes beyond simple observation. He means notice the way the starch clouds the water, but also notice the rate at which it clouds, the texture of the cloudiness, the way the rice grains move through the water, the sound they make as you agitate them. He means develop a relationship with these physical materials that allows you to sense their state and their readiness through multiple simultaneous channels of perception. But he says only, watch the water, and Akbar does his best to comply, seeing but not yet perceiving. The kitchen operates now with about 600 workers instead of 800, not because of a dramatic policy change, but through gradual attrition. When senior workers die or retire, they're not always replaced. When specialized positions become vacant, sometimes the work is redistributed to existing staff, who absorb the new responsibilities without absorbing all the expertise that came with them. The changes are small enough that no single change feels catastrophic, but their cumulative effect is that the system is slowly becoming less specialized, less intricate, less capable of the extraordinary precision that defined it 3 decades earlier. The Pulao section still operates, still produces elaborate rice dishes that contemporary observers praise, but there are now 3 head cooks doing work that was previously divided among 5. The bread section has consolidated its tandoors, running fewer ovens at higher intensity rather than maintaining multiple ovens at different temperatures for different types of bread. The sweet section has reduced its repertoire, focusing on the most popular preparations and letting some of the more obscure, labor-intensive recipes fall out of regular practice. Ustad Mahmoud, the master of rice and pulao preparations, died 2 years ago at the age of 79, and his position was filled by his senior apprentice, a competent cook named Salim, who nonetheless represents a slight step down in expertise. Salim knows the techniques, follows the procedures, produces excellent results, but he doesn't have Mahmoud's intuitive understanding, that almost supernatural ability to diagnose problems before they became visible, to adjust preparations based on subtle environmental factors that he couldn't articulate but somehow felt. When Mahmoud died, something died with him, some quality of knowledge that existed only in his practice and couldn't be fully transmitted even to his most devoted students. Emperor Aurangzeb himself has changed. At 70, he's become more austere, more focused on religious orthodoxy, less interested in the elaborate culinary display that characterized earlier Mughal courts. He still eats well. The kitchen still prepares multiple dishes for each meal, but there's a sense that the food is less central to his concept of imperial dignity, that the extraordinary investment in kitchen infrastructure is maintained more from institutional momentum than from active royal enthusiasm. The economic pressures are also mounting. The empire is engaged in expensive military campaigns in the Deccan, trying to extend Mughal control into southern territories that resist incorporation. These campaigns drain the treasury, and while the imperial household budget is still enormous, it's no longer growing, and there are increasing pressures to find efficiencies, to reduce expenditures that seem excessive or unnecessary. The kitchen budget hasn't been cut dramatically, but it's been frozen, which in practical terms means it's gradually shrinking as prices rise and inflation erodes purchasing power. Rahim sees these changes but doesn't entirely understand their implications. His world is still rice. His daily work still consists of the same fundamental tasks, and the satisfaction he takes from perfectly cooked grain hasn't diminished. But he notices small things that trouble him. The quality of saffron has become more variable, suggesting that procurement is accepting lower grades than before. The variety of rice available has narrowed slightly, some of the rarer regional varieties appearing less frequently. The replacement of brass vessels with cheaper iron ones in some sections of the kitchen, changing the way certain dishes taste in ways that are subtle but real. He's training Akbar because the kitchen administration has decided that systematic training programs are needed, that the traditional apprenticeship model, where boys arrived young and learned through years of observation and gradual participation, is too slow, too inefficient, too dependent on the availability of master teachers. So now there are formal training rotations, structured curricula, attempts to codify knowledge that has always existed in practice. Rahim appreciates the intent, but struggles with the execution, because rice cooking is not easily reducible to instructions. How do you know when it's ready? Akbar asks, watching Rahim inspect a batch of soaking rice. Rahim picks up a grain, presses it between his fingers, holds it up to the light, examines the way it's swollen. You know, he says, which is true, but unhelpful. But how? Akbar persists, and Rahim realizes that this is the central problem. The knowing comes from repetition, from making the same judgment hundreds of times and receiving immediate feedback about whether you were right, from gradually calibrating your senses to recognize patterns that don't have names. You can't shortcut this process. You can't explain your way to expertise. You have to live it day after day until the knowledge becomes part of you. Soak 50 batches, Rahim finally says. Watch what happens when you soak them too long, too short, just right. Learn to see the difference. It's better advice than his first answer, but it's still fundamentally saying, there is no shortcut, you must walk the long path. And even then, you might not arrive at the same destination, because perhaps expertise is not just about time and repetition, but also about some ineffable quality of attention or sensitivity that some people have and others don't. The afternoon brings a reminder of what the kitchen is still capable of when it focuses its full resources on a single goal. Word arrives that the emperor will host a small diplomatic reception in 3 days, and the kitchen receives instructions to prepare a traditional Mughal feast, the kind of elaborate meal that showcases the full range of their capabilities. This is the kind of event that the kitchen system was designed for, and despite the gradual erosion of resources and expertise, it still snaps into action with impressive efficiency. The planning meeting involves the senior cooks from each section, and Rahim attends as the representative of rice preparations. The menu is traditional, drawn from recipes that have been prepared for decades. There will be a lamb pulao cooked with the most aged basmati, layered with saffron and rose water, a white korma, slow cooked in cream and ground almonds until the meat is fall-apart tender. Several types of kebabs, each prepared with different spice blends, breads including naan, rumali roti, and a special paratha layered with silver leaf, sweet rice studded with dried fruits and soaked in syrup, and various accompaniments including ratas, pickles, and chutneys. The head cook, who now holds the position that was once the Mir Bakawal, though the title has been quietly dropped, assigns responsibilities with the ease of someone who has overseen hundreds of such events. The lamb section will begin their preparations tomorrow, starting with the overnight marination. The bread section will need to coordinate timing carefully because breads must be served hot, which means baking them continuously throughout the meal rather than preparing them in advance. The sweet section will make their preparations the day before, allowing flavors to develop overnight. And Rahim's section will prepare the rice for the pulao, washing and soaking it on the morning of the feast, timing everything so that the rice is ready precisely when the lamb is ready to be combined with it. Over the next 3 days, the kitchen achieves something remarkable. It produces a feast that equals the standard of earlier decades, a meal that the diplomatic guests praise with what seemed to be genuine enthusiasm rather than polite obligation. The lamb pulao is perfect, each grain of rice separate and scented, the meat tender and flavorful. The korma has the right balance of richness and delicacy. The breads are hot and fresh throughout the meal. The sweets are elegant and not overly heavy. By any objective measure, the kitchen has succeeded. But Rahim notices something as he watches the service of his pulao. The rice is excellent, probably the best rice he's personally cooked in years, drawing on everything he knows and everything he can control. But it's not quite what Ustad Mahmoud would have produced. There's a quality missing, something in the balance of flavors, or the texture of the grain, or the way the saffron has infused through the rice. Something subtle enough that probably no one else notices, but real enough that Rahim can't ignore it. The rice is a triumph, and it's also a reminder of loss, a demonstration that even at their best, they're no longer quite as good as they once were. After the feast, after the cleanup, after the kitchen has returned to its regular rhythm, Rahim finds himself sitting with Akbar during a rare moment of calm. The boy has made progress, learning to wash rice properly, beginning to develop a feel for soaking times, starting to understand the relationship between preparation and result. He will probably become a competent rice cook, might even become a good one. But will he become a master? Will he develop the kind of deep, intuitive expertise that characterized the previous generations? Rahim doesn't know, and increasingly, he suspects that the question itself is becoming irrelevant, because mastery might be a concept that belongs to a different era, when the empire was younger and richer and more confident, when investing decades in the perfection of a single technique seemed like a reasonable use of human potential. The empire is changing, the world is changing, and perhaps the kind of extreme specialization that created the Mughal kitchen's legendary capabilities is becoming unsustainable, a luxury that future generations will remember with a mixture of admiration and bewilderment. "Why did you become a cook?" Akbar asks during this quiet moment, and Rahim considers the question carefully, because it's not something he's thought about explicitly. The honest answer is that he didn't choose. He was placed in the kitchen as a child, assigned to this work by administrators who made such decisions, and he simply learned what he was taught and became good at what he practiced. But that answer makes his life sound like something that happened to him rather than something he actively shaped. And that doesn't feel quite true either. "I wanted to make something perfect," Rahim finally says. And as he speaks the words, he realizes they're true in ways he hadn't fully understood. Rice is simple: water and grain and heat. But getting it perfect is hard. Every batch is a chance to do it right, to create something that's exactly what it should be. I like that. I still like that. Akbar nods, but Rahim can see he doesn't fully understand yet, because understanding only comes from experience, from the satisfaction of success, and the frustration of failure repeated hundreds of times until you've internalized what perfection feels like and why it matters. Maybe Akbar will get there. Maybe the next generation will develop their own forms of expertise, different from what came before, but valuable in their own ways. Or maybe the whole system is slowly winding down, maintaining its forms and structures while losing the animating spirit that once made it extraordinary. The kitchen archives contain recipes, detailed instructions for hundreds of dishes, careful notes about techniques and ingredients and timing. These documents will survive, preserved by administrators who understand their historical value, even if they don't fully understand their practical content. Future generations will read these recipes and marvel at the complexity, the precision, the sheer amount of human effort invested in creating perfect food. They'll try to recreate the dishes, following the instructions as carefully as they can, and they'll produce results that are good, sometimes even excellent. But they won't produce exactly what the Mughal kitchen produced at its height, because the recipes can't capture everything. They can't capture the knowledge that lived only in the hands of experienced cooks, the adjustments made based on the feel of the rice, or the smell of the spices, or the sound of the boiling water. They can't capture the intuition developed over decades, the ability to diagnose problems before they become visible, the sense of timing that went beyond clocks or measurements. They can't capture the context, the system of specialization and training and quality control that supported individual expertise. What we're left with, is a partial record of something remarkable. Fragments of a system that achieved a kind of perfection in its narrow domain and then gradually faded as the conditions that sustained it changed. The recipes survive, but the cooking is gone. The buildings survive, but the work they contained is memory. The stories survive, but the daily reality of life in those kitchens, the boring, repetitive, extraordinarily skilled work that hundreds of people devoted their lives to, exists now only in scattered documents and the imagination of people who try to reconstruct something they never experienced. Rahim will work in the kitchen for another 12 years, training dozens more students, maintaining standards that slowly drift away from the standards he learned as a boy. Akbar will become a competent rice cook, perhaps even a good one, and he'll train students of his own who will be slightly less skilled than him. And the gradual decline will continue, slow enough that no generation experiences it as catastrophic, but real enough that after several generations, the connection to the original expertise will be almost entirely severed. And perhaps that's simply how knowledge works. It's created through enormous investment of time and resources and human attention. It reaches a peak of development under specific conditions, and then it slowly dissipates as those conditions change, leaving behind only traces and memories, and the nagging sense that something valuable has been lost, even if we can't quite articulate what it was or why it mattered. The Mughal kitchen, at its height, was an achievement, but it was also a historical moment, not a permanent state, and its passing was as inevitable as the rice harvest each year, as the turning of seasons, as the gradual transformation of empires into memories of themselves. You're sitting in a small office in the merchant quarter of Agra in the year 1665, watching a man named Hassan Abdullah carefully record numbers in a leather-bound ledger, his handwriting so precise that each Persian numeral looks like it was drawn with a ruler, and the numbers he's recording represent something that seems almost absurd in its specificity: the exact quantity of rose petals purchased by the imperial household kitchen in the previous month, broken down by variety, by garden of origin, by date of harvest, and by the price paid per maund, which is a unit of weight equal to roughly 80 pounds. Hassan Abdullah is not a cook, he's not a gardener, he's a specialized merchant whose entire business consists of procuring aromatic ingredients for the Mughal court, primarily rose petals, but also other flowers, herbs, and fragrant materials that are used in the preparation of scented rice dishes. His position exists at the intersection of agriculture, commerce, and culinary art, and the records he keeps with such care are a window into an economic system that's both sophisticated and strange, where the value of flowers can sometimes exceed the value of grain, where scent is commodified with the same precision as spices or metals. The ledger entry for last month shows purchases from 17 different rose gardens in and around Agra, each garden producing roses with slightly different characteristics. There's the garden at Itmadu-Dowlah's tomb, which produces deep red roses prized for their color retention when dried. There's the garden maintained by a wealthy merchant family named Lal, which specializes in pale pink roses that have an unusually intense fragrance. There's a garden on the outskirts of the city, run by a woman named Fatima Begum, one of the few female garden proprietors, whose roses are considered ideal for distillation into rose water because of their high oil content. The prices vary dramatically based on quality and timing. Early season roses, harvested in late March when the flowers first bloom, command premium prices because their scent is most intense. Mid-season roses from April and early May are more abundant and therefore cheaper, but still acceptable for most culinary uses. Late-season roses from late May onward are the cheapest because the heat has already begun to diminish their fragrance, and these are typically used for lower-grade preparations or sold to merchants who supply less demanding customers. But it's not just timing that affects price. There's also the question of harvest technique, which matters more than you might think. Roses for culinary use must be picked at a specific time of day, after the morning dew has dried, but before the afternoon heat begins, and they must be picked by hand, selecting only flowers that are at peak bloom, neither too tight nor too far open. The petals must then be separated from the flowers immediately, sorted to remove any damaged or discolored pieces, and either used fresh or dried, using specific techniques that preserve both color and fragrance. Hassan Abdullah's business depends on his ability to evaluate rose quality accurately and quickly, making judgments that will affect the satisfaction of palace cooks who are extraordinarily discriminating about their ingredients. He purchases roses in bulk from the gardens, takes responsibility for the drying process if needed, and delivers finished product to the palace at agreed-upon intervals. His profit margin is relatively thin, perhaps 10 to 15% of the purchase price, but the volumes are substantial enough that the business is quite lucrative. Last year, his records show, he sold nearly 2,000 maunds of dried rose petals to the imperial household alone, representing hundreds of thousands of individual roses. The drying process, which Hassan Abdullah oversees personally in a dedicated facility near his office, is more complex than simply leaving flowers in the sun. Roses dried too quickly in direct sunlight lose their color and much of their fragrance. Roses dried too slowly in shade may develop mold or fermentation that ruins their quality. The optimal method involves spreading the petals in thin layers on cloth stretched across frames, placed in a covered area with good air circulation, and turned regularly over the course of 2 to 3 days until they reach exactly the right level of dryness, crisp enough to store without spoiling, but not so dry that they crumble into powder. Hassan Abdullah employs 12 workers in his drying facility, mostly women because they're considered to have more delicate touch and better attention to detail for the sorting and turning of petals. These workers are specialists in their own right, able to judge by touch whether petals need more drying time, quick to spot and remove any petals showing signs of discoloration or decay. The work is seasonal, intense during the rose harvest months, much lighter during the rest of the year. And the workers are paid by the maund of finished product rather than by the day, creating incentives for both speed and quality. But roses are only part of Hassan Abdullah's business. He also procures jasmine flowers, which are used in certain sweet rice preparations and require even more careful handling than roses because they're more delicate and their fragrance dissipates more quickly. He supplies dried herbs, including mint and cilantro leaves, which are used as garnishes and flavor elements. He occasionally deals in more exotic aromatics, dried orange blossoms from gardens in the Punjab, vetiver roots from southern regions, even small quantities of oud wood from traders who source it from Southeast Asia, though the oud is primarily for perfume rather than culinary use. The complexity of Hassan Abdullah's business becomes apparent when you consider the coordination required. He needs to maintain relationships with dozens of gardens, each with their own proprietors and their own standards. He needs to time his purchases to match both the harvest schedule and the palace's consumption patterns, buying enough to meet demand without accumulating excessive inventory that might deteriorate in storage. He needs to manage his drying facility, ensuring quality control while maintaining efficient production. He needs to navigate the palace bureaucracy, maintaining good relationships with the kitchen administrators who approve his deliveries and authorize his payments. And all of this exists in service of what is fundamentally an aesthetic preference. The scented rice preparations that the Mughal court favors could theoretically be made without rose petals, without these elaborate sourcing networks, without Hassan Abdullah's specialized expertise. The rice would still be edible, might even taste good, but it wouldn't be right. It wouldn't match the Mughal concept of what rice should be, which is not just nourishment, but art, not just food, but an expression of refinement and cultural sophistication. This morning, Hassan Abdullah is reviewing his supply contracts for the upcoming season, which begins in about 6 weeks when the first roses bloom. He's negotiating with garden proprietors, discussing prices and quantities, trying to secure commitments that will ensure he has sufficient supply to meet palace demand. Some gardens he's worked with for years, and the negotiations are relatively straightforward, continuing existing arrangements with minor adjustments. Other gardens are new prospects, either newly established or previously supplying other merchants, and these negotiations require more careful assessment. He's currently meeting with a garden manager named Ravi, who represents a large garden owned by a wealthy family that also has interests in textile manufacturing and money lending. Ravi is proposing a significant increase in the roses they'll supply to Hassan Abdullah this season, nearly doubling last year's quantity, and Hassan Abdullah is trying to determine whether this is a good opportunity or a potential problem. The garden has expanded, Ravi explains. We've planted an additional 2 acres, focusing on the varieties that command the highest prices. The bushes are mature now, ready to produce. We're looking for buyers who can handle volume. Hassan Abdullah considers this carefully. More supply could be good. It would give him reserve capacity, allow him to meet unexpected demand, perhaps even expand beyond the palace to supply other wealthy households. But it could also be problematic if the quality isn't consistent, or if the increased supply leads to price pressure that erodes his margins, or if he ends up with excess inventory that he can't sell. I'll need to inspect the garden, Hassan Abdullah says. See the new plantings, evaluate the quality. If the roses meet my standards, we can discuss numbers. This is standard practice, and Ravi nods agreement. They schedule a visit for next week, when Ravi will show Hassan Abdullah the garden, let him examine the roses, perhaps even allow him to take samples for testing. The negotiation will continue over multiple meetings, gradually working toward terms that both parties find acceptable, or determining that they can't reach agreement and need to pursue other options. After Ravi leaves, Hassan Abdullah returns to his ledgers, reviewing last year's numbers, looking for patterns that might inform his decisions for the coming season. He notices that his sales of pale pink roses, the specialty of the Lal family garden, declined in the second half of the year, while sales of deep red roses remained steady. This could mean several things. Perhaps the palace cook's preferences shifted, or perhaps the quality of the pale pink roses wasn't consistent, or perhaps there was some entirely unrelated factor like a particular cook retiring or a change in menu planning. These are the kinds of questions that Hassan Abdullah has learned to pay attention to over his 15 years in this business. Changes in demand patterns can signal important shifts in palace preferences, and catching these shifts early can provide competitive advantage. If the palace is moving away from pale pink roses, Hassan Abdullah should probably reduce his commitments to gardens that specialize in them, reallocating his purchases toward the varieties that remain in favor. But he needs to be careful not to overreact to short-term fluctuations, to distinguish between genuine preference changes and temporary variations. The afternoon brings a visit from one of his drying facility workers, a woman named Jamila, who has worked for Hassan Abdullah for 8 years and has developed exceptional skill at evaluating rose quality. She's concerned about a batch of roses that arrived this morning from a garden that Hassan Abdullah has worked with for years, the garden at Itmaduddaullah's tomb that produces the prized deep red varieties. Something's wrong with them, Jamila says, and Hassan Abdullah immediately sets aside his ledgers and follows her to the facility because Jamila's judgments are rarely mistaken, and if she says something is wrong, it probably is. At the facility, Jamila shows him the roses in question. To Hassan Abdullah's eye, they look fine. The right color, apparently fresh, no obvious signs of damage or decay. But when Jamila has him smell them, he immediately understands her concern. The scent is off, not dramatically, but noticeably, lacking some of the depth and complexity that should be present in roses from this garden at this time of year. When were they harvested? Hassan Abdullah asks. This morning, according to the delivery note. Hassan Abdullah examines the roses more carefully, looking for clues about what might have gone wrong. The timing is right. Early season, peak bloom period. The visual quality is good, but the scent, which is ultimately what matters most for culinary use, is definitely compromised. He considers several possibilities. Perhaps the roses were picked too early in the day, while dew was still on them, which can dilute the fragrance oils. Perhaps they were transported in closed containers that trapped moisture and began a fermentation process. Perhaps the garden has some problem, disease, irrigation issues, soil depletion, that's affecting the plant's ability to produce essential oils. Don't start drying these yet, Hassan Abdullah decides. I need to visit the garden, talk to the manager, figure out what's happening. If this is a temporary problem, we can work through it. If it's something more serious, I need to know now, before we're in the middle of the season with compromised supply. This is exactly the kind of problem that Hassan Abdullah's expertise and relationships are meant to handle, but it's also a reminder of how fragile this entire system is. The gardens depend on environmental conditions that are only partially controllable. The roses depend on care and attention at every stage, from planting through harvest. The drying process requires skill and vigilance, and all of this effort is invested in producing something that has no nutritional value, no practical function beyond its aesthetic contribution to dishes that could technically be made without it. And yet, Hassan Abdullah reflects, as he prepares to visit the garden tomorrow, this supposedly frivolous commerce employs hundreds of people in Agra alone. Gardeners, harvest workers, drying facility employees, merchants, transporters. It generates significant economic activity, creates livelihoods, supports families. The roses may be decorative, but the economy built around them is quite real, quite substantial, quite important to the people whose survival depends on it. But what happens when that economy shifts? What happens when the demand that sustains this entire network of gardens and merchants and workers changes for reasons that have nothing to do with the quality of the roses themselves? What happens when empires change, when preferences shift, when the resources that make all of this possible start to contract? These are questions that Hassan Abdullah doesn't spend much time thinking about, because his business is doing well and his future seems secure, but they're questions that perhaps he should be considering, because the world is less stable than it appears, and the economics of scent may be more vulnerable than anyone realizes. You're walking through the rose garden at Itmadu Dowlah's tomb on a morning in early April 1665, following Hassan Abdullah as he examines rose bushes with the concentrated attention of someone whose livelihood depends on understanding what he's seeing. And what you're seeing, what he's seeing, is not encouraging. The garden is beautiful in the way that Mughal gardens are always beautiful, geometrically precise, divided into quadrants by water channels, planted with careful attention to symmetry and proportion. The tomb itself, built 50 years ago for the father of Empress Nur Jahan, rises at the center of the complex. Its white marble, inlaid with semi-precious stones catching the morning light. The roses are arranged in beds along the pathways and around the tomb, hundreds of bushes planted in neat rows, and from a distance, everything looks perfect, abundant, thriving. But Hassan Abdullah is not looking from a distance. He's crouching beside individual bushes, examining leaves, checking stems, and most importantly, smelling the flowers with the kind of focused attention that reveals details invisible to casual observation. And what his nose is telling him is that something has changed in this garden. Something subtle but significant. The garden manager, a man named Qasim, who inherited this position from his father and has managed these grounds for 12 years, walks beside Hassan Abdullah with increasing discomfort, because he knows what Hassan Abdullah is discovering, and he's been hoping to avoid this conversation for as long as possible. The irrigation changed, Qasim finally admits. 3 months ago, the water channel that feeds this section was diverted to supply a new garden being established for one of the emperor's grandsons. We're receiving less water, and what we receive comes at different times of day than before. Hassan Abdullah straightens up from examining a rose bush, processing this information and its implications. Water is fundamental to rose cultivation. Too little, and the plants become stressed. Too much, and they develop root problems. And the timing of irrigation affects when the plants bloom and how intensely. A change in irrigation regime would definitely explain why the roses are producing weaker fragrance oils, and it also suggests that this is not a temporary problem that will resolve itself, but a structural change that will affect this garden's production for the foreseeable future. Can you get the water supply restored? Hassan Abdullah asks, though he already suspects the answer. Qasim shakes his head. I've tried. I've submitted requests through the palace administration, but the new garden takes priority. It's a direct imperial commission. Our garden is old, established, considered less important. We're told to make do with what we have. This is a problem with no easy solution. Hassan Abdullah has a contract with the palace kitchen to supply a certain quantity of roses from this specific garden, because the palace cooks prefer these particular roses for specific preparations. But if the garden can no longer produce roses of acceptable quality, Hassan Abdullah either needs to find a replacement source that can replicate these characteristics, or he needs to renegotiate his contract with the palace, admitting that he cannot fulfill his commitments and risking damage to his reputation and business relationships. How bad is it? Hassan Abdullah asks. Show me the worst affected sections. Qasim leads him to the northern quadrant of the garden, where the water shortage is most severe. Here, the roses are visibly stressed. Leaves with brown edges, fewer flowers per bush, blooms that are smaller than they should be and opening too quickly, rushing through their cycle before they've developed full fragrance. Hassan Abdullah examines several bushes, confirming what he feared. These roses are unusable for his purposes. They might be acceptable for general ornamental purposes, for visitors who want to see beautiful gardens, but they don't meet the standards required for culinary applications in the imperial kitchen. What about the other quadrants? Hassan Abdullah asks. Better, but not as good as they should be. The roses closer to the main water channel are getting adequate irrigation, but even they're affected by the change in timing. We used to water in the early morning, when the plants could absorb moisture before the heat of the day. Now the water comes in late afternoon, which is less optimal. Hassan Abdullah walks through the other sections of the garden, making his own assessment. Qasim is right. The roses in the better watered sections are acceptable. Not as good as they were, but still usable. He estimates that this garden will probably produce about 60% of its normal yield of high-quality roses this season, with another 20% at a lower grade that might be suitable for less demanding applications, and 20% that's essentially worthless for his purposes. This is a disaster, but it's also not entirely unexpected. Hassan Abdullah has been in this business long enough to know that gardens are vulnerable to all sorts of disruptions: weather, disease, administrative changes, competition for resources. The stability that seems to characterize the Mughal court's operations is partly an illusion, or rather, it's an achievement that requires constant maintenance and adjustment, not a natural state. The palace cooks can count on having roses available because merchants like Hassan Abdullah absorb these disruptions, finding alternative sources, managing around problems, maintaining supply chains despite constant small crises. "I'll take what you can provide at the quality I need," Hassan Abdullah tells Qasim, "but I'll need to reduce my purchase commitment accordingly, and I'll need to find other sources to make up the difference." Qasim nods, relieved that Hassan Abdullah isn't simply cancelling their arrangement entirely. The garden still depends on the income from rose sales to pay its workers and maintain its operations, and losing a major buyer like Hassan Abdullah would create serious financial problems. Even a reduced purchase is better than nothing. They negotiate new terms. Hassan Abdullah will buy roses from the better watered sections at the usual price, but his total purchase will be about half of what was originally contracted. This is painful for both of them, but it's better than the alternatives. The negotiation takes about an hour. Sitting in the shade of the Tombs arcade, drinking tea that Qasim's assistant brings, working through quantities and delivery schedules and payment terms with the careful attention that significant commerce requires. After leaving the garden, Hassan Abdullah spends the rest of the day visiting other rose gardens around Agra, trying to determine where he can source the additional roses he now needs. This is complex because different gardens produce different varieties of roses, and he can't simply substitute one variety for another. The palace cooks have specific preferences and expectations, and part of Hassan Abdullah's value as a merchant is his ability to provide exactly what they want, not approximate substitutes. His first stop is the Lal family garden, which produces the pale pink roses that Hassan Abdullah noticed were declining in popularity last year. But preferences change, and maybe the palace cooks would be willing to accept more pale pink roses if the alternative is not having enough of the deep red variety. The Lal garden manager, a younger man named Arun, who represents the third generation of his family to manage these grounds, is eager to increase his sales to Hassan Abdullah. "We can definitely provide more roses," Arun says enthusiastically. "Our bushes are healthy. We've actually expanded our plantings in the past 2 years. We can handle whatever quantity you need." Hassan Abdullah walks through the Lal garden, examining the roses, and he has to admit they're excellent. Healthy plants, abundant blooms, strong fragrance. The pale pink variety doesn't have quite the same intensity of color as the deep red roses from Itmad Dowlah's garden, but the fragrance is actually superior, more complex, with layers of scent that develop over time. For certain applications, these roses might actually be preferable. "I'll take an increased quantity," Hassan Abdullah decides. "But I need to confirm with the palace kitchen first that they're willing to accept more of this variety. Can you wait a few days for confirmation?" Arun agrees, and they discuss provisional terms that will be finalized once Hassan Abdullah receives approval from the palace. This is how commerce actually works in practice. Not through fixed contracts and rigid terms, but through ongoing negotiation, adaptation to changing circumstances, relationships built over years that allow for flexibility when problems arise. Hassan Abdullah's next visit is to Fatima Begum's garden, the one known for roses ideal for distillation into rose water. Fatima Begum herself meets with him, a rare occurrence, because most garden proprietors delegate these business meetings to managers. She's probably in her 60s, a widow who took over the garden after her husband's death 15 years ago and transformed it from a moderate operation into one of the most respected rose gardens in the region. I heard about the water problems at Itmad-ud-Dawla's garden, Fatima Begum says, before Hassan Abdullah can even explain why he's visiting. Garden managers talk. Everyone knows about the water diversion to the new imperial garden. Can you help? Hassan Abdullah asks directly, because Fatima Begum appreciates directness and dislikes elaborate social preliminaries to business discussions. Maybe. My roses aren't the same variety as the Itmad-ud-Dawla garden, higher oil content, different fragrance profile. But for many culinary applications, they work well. I can provide you with whatever quantity you need, within reason. They walk through her garden, which is less formal than the imperial gardens, but more intensively productive. Every available space is planted with roses, arranged in beds that maximize sun exposure and facilitate efficient harvesting. The irrigation system is sophisticated, using a series of small channels that can be individually controlled to provide exactly the right amount of water to different sections. Fatima Begum has clearly thought deeply about rose cultivation as a business, optimizing for production and quality rather than for ornamental beauty. The palace kitchen will need to approve any change in variety, Hassan Abdullah explains. They're very particular about their ingredients. Of course they are, Fatima Begum says, with a slight smile. They're particular because merchants like you taught them to be particular. You created this market for high-quality roses, and now you're constrained by the expectations you established. This is more perceptive than Hassan Abdullah is entirely comfortable with, because it's true. The market for premium roses exists partly because merchants like him have spent years cultivating it, educating buyers about quality differences, creating demand for specific characteristics. But this same discriminating demand that makes the market lucrative also makes it difficult to adjust when supply problems arise. They negotiate terms similar to what Hassan Abdullah discussed with Arun at the Lal Garden. Provisional agreement subject to palace approval, with the understanding that if the palace won't accept these roses as substitutes, the deal will be cancelled without penalty. Fatima Begum is confident that her roses will be acceptable, and Hassan Abdullah is inclined to agree, but he needs formal confirmation before committing to large purchases. By the end of the day, Hassan Abdullah has visited 6 gardens and negotiated provisional agreements with 4 of them. If all these agreements are approved, he'll have sufficient supply to meet his obligations to the palace kitchen, though the mix of varieties will be different from previous years. The question now is whether the palace cooks will accept these changes or whether they'll insist on the exact specifications of previous contracts, which Hassan Abdullah can no longer fulfill because of the water problems at Itmad-ud-Dawla's garden. The next morning, Hassan Abdullah requests a meeting with the kitchen administrator responsible for ingredient procurement, a bureaucrat named Mirza Rahman who has held this position for 5 years and who approaches his duties with the meticulous attention to detail that characterizes successful palace administration. Hassan Abdullah explains the situation: the water diversion, the reduced quality from Itmad-ud-Dawla's garden, the alternative sources he's identified. Mirza Rahman listens without interrupting, taking notes in his own ledger, and when Hassan Abdullah finishes, he sits quietly for a moment, considering the implications. His responsibility is to ensure that the kitchen has the ingredients it needs when it needs them, at reasonable costs and at the quality standards the cooks expect. Hassan Abdullah's supply problems are, From Mirza Rahman's perspective, a potential disruption to the smooth operation of palace food service, which is unacceptable. Can you maintain total supply volume? Mirza Rahman asks. Yes, with the alternative sources I've identified. At comparable quality, the roses will be high quality, but different varieties than previously. Some cooks may need to adjust their preparations slightly. This is the crucial question, and Mirza Rahman knows it. He could insist on exact specifications, tell Hassan Abdullah to find sources that exactly replicate the Itmad-ud-Dawla roses, which might be impossible and would certainly be expensive. Or he could accept Hassan Abdullah's proposed solution, allowing some flexibility in varieties, which would require the cooks to adapt, but would maintain supply and keep costs reasonable. I'll need to consult with the head cooks, Mirza Rahman decides. Give me 3 days. In the meantime, continue with your normal procurement from sources that aren't affected by the water problems. We'll discuss the substitutions before the peak of the season. Hassan Abdullah leaves this meeting with mixed feelings. Mirza Rahman didn't reject his proposal, which is good, but he also didn't approve it, which means uncertainty at exactly the time when Hassan Abdullah needs to be confirming his garden contracts for the season. This uncertainty is expensive. It means he can't finalize deals, can't lock in prices, can't plan his operations with confidence. But it's also unavoidable because the palace administration moves at its own pace, following its own procedures, and Hassan Abdullah has no power to accelerate these processes. Over the next 3 days, Hassan Abdullah continues his regular business operations while waiting for Mirza Rahman's decision. He takes delivery of jasmine flowers from a garden in the suburbs, inspects their quality, oversees their drying. He reviews his financial records, calculating costs and margins, projecting income for the season under different scenarios. He meets with other merchants who supply different ingredients to the palace, trading information about administrative procedures and procurement trends, trying to stay informed about changes that might affect his business. On the 3rd day, a messenger arrives from Mirza Rahman with a written response. The palace kitchen will accept the alternative rose varieties that Hassan Abdullah has proposed, with the condition that he provides samples for testing before any large-scale purchases, and with the understanding that if the cooks find the substitutions unacceptable after testing, Hassan Abdullah will need to find other solutions at his own expense. This is about as good an outcome as Hassan Abdullah could have hoped for. He immediately sends messages to the gardens he's negotiated with, confirming his purchase commitments and arranging for sample deliveries to the palace. The samples arrive over the next week, and the palace cooks test them in various preparations, evaluating how they perform compared to the roses they're accustomed to using. The results are mixed but generally positive. The pale pink roses from the Lal garden work well in sweet preparations but are less suitable for savory applications where the deeper color of red roses is preferred. Fatima Begum's high oil roses are excellent for dishes where rosewater is used, but their stronger fragrance can be overwhelming in delicate preparations. The cooks will need to adjust their techniques slightly, using these roses differently than they use the Itmad-ud-Dawla varieties, but the adjustments are manageable, within the range of normal culinary adaptation. Hassan Abdullah receives formal approval to proceed with his modified procurement plan, and he finalizes his contracts with the various gardens, locking in quantities and prices for the season. The crisis has been managed, supply will be maintained, the palace kitchen will receive the roses it needs, even if they're not exactly the roses it's accustomed to receiving. From an outside perspective, nothing significant has happened. The system has worked as it's supposed to work, absorbing a disruption and continuing to function. But Hassan Abdullah knows that something has changed, something subtle but important. The system has revealed its fragility, shown that it depends on conditions that can shift without warning, that the stability everyone depends on is maintained through constant improvisation and adaptation rather than through inherent strength. The water diversion that compromised one garden could happen to others. The preferences that currently favor roses could shift toward other aromatics. The palace administration that currently values Hassan Abdullah's services could decide that direct procurement from gardens would be more economical, eliminating the merchant layer entirely. These are not immediate threats, but they're real possibilities, reminders that Hassan Abdullah's business exists in a context that's larger than him and beyond his control, that the economics of scent are ultimately dependent on the economics of empire, and that empires, however grand they appear, are subject to forces that their administrators can't always manage or predict. But for now, for this season, Hassan Abdullah has roses to procure, contracts to fulfill, and a business to run, and the larger questions about sustainability and long-term stability can wait for another day. You're standing in Hassan Abdullah's office 15 years later in the year 1680, and the leather-bound ledger on his desk tells a story that numbers alone can't fully capture, a story of gradual decline dressed in the language of careful accounting, of a business that's still profitable but noticeably smaller than it was, of markets that are contracting in ways that everyone can sense but no one wants to explicitly acknowledge. Hassan Abdullah is now 58 years old, his beard fully grey, his hands showing the marks of decades spent handling flowers and negotiating contracts. He's still in the rose business, still supplying the imperial kitchen, still maintaining his network of gardens and his drying facility. But the numbers in this year's ledger are telling him something he's been reluctant to admit. His business is slowly dying, not through any failure of his own, but through changes in the world that his expertise can't prevent or solve. The imperial household's purchases of dried rose petals have declined by approximately 40% over the past 15 years. This hasn't happened suddenly or dramatically. It's been a gradual reduction, a few percentage points each year, easy to rationalize as temporary fluctuations or seasonal variations until you step back and look at the long-term trend. Hassan Abdullah has his records going back to when he started this business 28 years ago. And the pattern is unmistakable. Steady growth for the first decade, peak volumes in the mid-1660s, and then slow but consistent decline ever since. The reasons for this decline are multiple and interconnected, not reducible to any single cause. Emperor Aurangzeb's increasing religious austerity has definitely played a role. He's less interested in elaborate culinary display than his predecessors, more focused on military campaigns and religious orthodoxy than on maintaining the refined aesthetic culture that characterized earlier Mughal courts. The kitchen still prepares scented rice, still uses rose petals in various preparations, but with less frequency, less elaboration, less of the extravagant abundance that once defined imperial dining. But it's not just imperial preference. The economic pressures on the empire have also affected the palace household budget, creating pressure to reduce expenditures on items that are seen as luxuries rather than necessities. Rose petals fall squarely into the luxury category. They're not required for nutrition. They don't preserve food or enhance its basic edibility. They serve purely aesthetic purposes. When administrators look for places to cut spending, ingredients like rose petals are obvious targets, and there's also competition from other suppliers. As the palace purchases have declined, Hassan Abdullah has tried to expand his customer base beyond the imperial household, selling to wealthy merchants, to other noble households, to restaurants and sweet shops that cater to affluent customers. But this market is crowded with merchants who don't maintain Hassan Abdullah's quality standards, who are willing to sell lower-grade products at cheaper prices, who compete on cost rather than quality. Hassan Abdullah has tried to compete in this market while maintaining his standards, but it's been difficult. A constant tension between preserving his reputation for quality and generating sufficient revenue to maintain his operations. This morning, Hassan Abdullah is meeting with his son, Ismail, who has been working in the business for the past 8 years and who Hassan Abdullah had hoped would eventually take over. But Ismail has news that Hassan Abdullah has been dreading. He's leaving the rose business to pursue other opportunities, specifically a position managing a textile trading company owned by a distant relative. "I don't see a future in roses," Ismail says, with the bluntness of someone who has thought about this decision carefully and knows it will hurt, but believes it's necessary. The market is shrinking. The palace is buying less. The gardens are struggling. The whole infrastructure that made this business work is slowly falling apart, and I don't think it's coming back. Hassan Abdullah wants to argue, wants to defend the business he's spent his adult life building, but he can't honestly refute what Ismail is saying, because the ledgers support his assessment. The business is still generating income. Hassan Abdullah is not facing immediate financial crisis, but the trajectory is clear, and Ismail is probably right that the future is not promising. "The textile trade is growing," Ismail continues. "There's increasing demand from European merchants for Indian fabrics, and the profit margins are better than roses. It's more stable, less dependent on palace patronage, less vulnerable to changes in imperial preferences." They talk for over an hour, Hassan Abdullah gradually accepting what he knew was probably inevitable. Ismail is 31 years old, has his own family to support, needs to think about his long-term security in ways that Hassan Abdullah, established and comfortable despite the decline, doesn't have to worry about as urgently. Losing Ismail means Hassan Abdullah will need to either find another successor or accept that his business will probably end with his own retirement or death, that the accumulated knowledge and relationships he's built over decades will disperse rather than being transmitted to the next generation. After Ismail leaves, Hassan Abdullah sits alone in his office, looking at the ledgers that document his career, and he finds himself thinking about what has been lost and what that loss means. The decline in rose purchases represents more than just reduced income for one merchant. It represents the slow dissolution of an entire economic ecosystem. The gardens that specialized in culinary roses, the workers who harvested and processed them, the networks of expertise and relationship that made the whole system function. He thinks about Qasim at the Itmad-ud-Dawla garden, who retired 5 years ago and whose replacement is competent but less skilled, less attentive to the subtle factors that determine rose quality. He thinks about the Lal family garden, which stopped growing roses 3 years ago and converted to grain production because the rose market had become too uncertain. He thinks about Fatima Begum, who died 2 years ago, and whose heirs sold her garden to a developer who subdivided it into building plots for wealthy merchants' houses, erasing in months what took decades to establish. The drying facility that Hassan Abdullah owns still operates, but at reduced capacity. He's down to 4 workers from the 12 he employed at peak, and those 4 workers are mostly older women who have been with him for years and who work more out of loyalty and habit than because the wages are particularly good. The younger generation has moved into other occupations: domestic service, textile work, agricultural labor, anything that seems more secure than the declining rose trade. Hassan Abdullah decides to visit one of his remaining supplier gardens, not because he has specific business to conduct, but because he wants to see with his own eyes how these places are managing, whether they're finding ways to adapt, or whether they're just slowly winding down, waiting for the inevitable end. He chooses a garden that's been supplying him for over 20 years, managed by a man named Suresh, who inherited the position from his father and who has always been reliable, consistent, easy to work with. The garden is noticeably different from Hassan Abdullah's last visit 2 years ago. The rose beds are smaller, occupying perhaps half the space they once did. The rest of the garden has been converted to vegetable cultivation: onions, tomatoes, leafy greens, crops that have more reliable markets and generate more consistent income. The roses that remain are still well maintained, still producing good quality flowers, but it's clear that they're no longer the primary focus, no longer the economic foundation of this operation. Suresh greets Hassan Abdullah warmly, offers tea, and they sit in the shade discussing the garden's situation. The roses don't pay like they used to, Suresh explains matter-of-factly, without apparent bitterness. The palace orders keep shrinking. The prices haven't increased enough to compensate, and maintaining roses is labor-intensive. Vegetables are easier, more predictable. I still grow roses because I enjoy them, because there's still some demand, but they're becoming more of a side business than the main activity. Hassan Abdullah understands this logic perfectly. It's rational, adaptive, exactly what any sensible manager would do in these circumstances. But he also feels a sense of loss that he can't quite articulate, because what's being lost is not just rose production, but accumulated expertise, specialized knowledge that took generations to develop, and that's disappearing because the economic conditions that justified its development no longer exist. Do you still have workers who know how to harvest properly? Hassan Abdullah asks. The timing, the selection, the handling. Suresh hesitates before answering. I have 2 older workers who know the traditional methods, but the younger workers I've hired in recent years, they learn vegetables, not roses. When my old workers retire or die, I'm not sure I'll be able to find replacements with the same skills. And I'm not sure it matters, because if the market keeps declining, I might not need those skills anyway. This is the practical reality of how knowledge is lost. Not through dramatic destruction, but through gradual irrelevance, through economic calculations that make perfect sense individually, but that collectively result in the erosion of capabilities that took centuries to build. The techniques for cultivating roses specifically for culinary use, for harvesting them at optimal fragrance, for drying them to preserve both color and scent. All of this knowledge is slowly vanishing because maintaining it no longer makes economic sense. They talk for another hour, discussing other gardens, other merchants, the general state of the rose trade in Agra. Suresh mentions that he knows of at least 5 gardens that have completely stopped rose cultivation in the past 5 years, converting to other crops or being sold for other uses. He mentions a merchant who specialized in jasmine who went bankrupt last year, unable to maintain his business as demand declined. The stories are similar: gradual reduction, attempts to adapt, eventual abandonment of specialization in favor of more general, more stable activities. Returning to his office in the late afternoon, Hassan Abdullah finds a message waiting from Mirza Rahman, the kitchen administrator he's worked with for years. The message is brief and businesslike. The palace will be reducing its standing orders for dried rose petals by another 20% starting next season, and they request Hassan Abdullah's confirmation that he can still fulfill the reduced quantities at current prices. Hassan Abdullah sits with this message for a long time, calculating its implications. A 20% reduction on top of the previous year's declines means his palace sales will be less than half of what they were at peak. He can still fulfill these orders. The declining demand has actually made procurement easier because the gardens are desperate for buyers and willing to negotiate favorable prices. But the question is whether it's worth continuing, whether maintaining this business at such reduced scale makes sense, or whether he should follow his son's advice and pivot to something else while he still has the resources and relationships to make such a transition successful. The rational answer is probably to transition out of roses, to use his capital and commercial connections to move into a growing market rather than staying in a declining one. But Hassan Abdullah has spent his entire adult life in this business, has built his identity around his expertise in aromatic ingredients, has relationships with gardens and cooks and administrators that span decades. Walking away would be admitting that this entire part of his life, this entire economic ecosystem he helped build and maintain, is ending. And that admission is harder than the simple business calculation suggests. He drafts a response to Mirza Rahman, confirming that he can fulfill the reduced orders at current prices, committing himself to at least one more season in the rose trade. Perhaps something will change. Perhaps a new emperor will have different preferences. Perhaps economic conditions will improve. Perhaps demand will stabilize or even increase. Or perhaps he's simply delaying the inevitable, clinging to a business model that's being overtaken by historical forces beyond his control. That evening, Hassan Abdullah finds himself going through his oldest ledgers, the ones from when he first started this business nearly 3 decades ago. The entries are written in a younger, less confident hand, recording transactions that seemed momentous at the time. His first major contract with the palace, his first negotiation with a garden proprietor, his first successful season where profits exceeded his initial projections. He remembers the optimism of those early years, the sense that he was building something lasting, creating a business that would support him and his family for generations, becoming part of the commercial infrastructure that made the Mughal court's refined lifestyle possible. He remembers the pride he felt when palace cooks would specifically request roses from his supplies, when his reputation for quality became known throughout Agra's merchant community, when he could walk through the market and be recognized as an expert, as someone whose knowledge and judgment were valued. And now, reading these old entries, Hassan Abdullah realizes that what he's mourning is not just the decline of his business, but the end of an entire way of understanding value. The Mughal court at its height operated on the assumption that beauty was worth investing in, that scent and flavor and aesthetic refinement were legitimate objects of serious attention and significant expenditure, that creating perfect scented rice was a worthy goal that justified elaborate supply chains and specialized expertise. But that assumption is being replaced by a different calculus, one that prioritizes military efficiency, religious orthodoxy, fiscal restraint, values that are perhaps more practical, but that leave less room for the kind of aesthetic elaboration that Hassan Abdullah's business depends on. The palace still buys roses, still prepares scented rice, but with a sense of maintaining tradition rather than celebrating it, of preserving forms while losing the animating spirit that made those forms meaningful. The ledgers document this transition in the language of declining numbers, but what they're really documenting is a shift in how empire conceives of itself, a change in what kinds of knowledge and expertise are considered valuable. Hassan Abdullah's deep understanding of rose cultivation, his ability to distinguish subtle gradations of quality, his network of relationships with gardens and cooks, all of this represents a form of refinement that's becoming obsolete, not because it lacks value in any absolute sense, but because the social and economic conditions that created demand for this refinement are changing. And perhaps this is simply how cultural knowledge works. It accumulates during periods of prosperity and stability, reaches peaks of sophistication under favorable conditions, and then gradually dissipates when those conditions change, leaving behind only fragmentary records and nostalgic memories. The techniques for creating perfect scented rice will survive in cookbooks and palace archives, but the living practice, the embodied knowledge of merchants and cooks and garden workers who made those techniques real, that knowledge is vanishing, dispersing, being replaced by other kinds of expertise suited to different times and different priorities. Hassan Abdullah will continue in the rose business for another 8 years, gradually winding down his operations as demand continues to decline. He'll never find a successor to take over his business. The next generation, including his own son, will pursue other opportunities that seem more promising. His drying facility will be sold after his retirement, converted into a warehouse for grain storage. His contracts with gardens will be allowed to lapse as the gardens themselves convert to other crops or are sold for development. His ledgers, meticulously maintained for over 3 decades, will be preserved by his family as curiosities, historical documents that record a vanished way of commerce. And the scented rice that the Mughal court once served with such pride will continue to be prepared, but less frequently, less elaborately, with ingredients that are good enough rather than perfect, by cooks who follow recipes rather than understanding principles, in a kitchen that functions efficiently but no longer aspires to artistry. The knowledge will persist in fragmentary form. Techniques will be remembered, recipes will be preserved, but the integrated system that once made that knowledge possible, the commercial and social infrastructure that supported extreme specialization and refinement, that system will be gone, replaced by something simpler, more economical, better suited to empire's changing needs. The economics of scent, it turns out, were always dependent on something larger than mere supply and demand. They were dependent on a specific conception of what empire should be, what values it should express, what kinds of refinement it should cultivate. And when that conception changed, when empire redefined itself around different priorities, the markets that served the old conception had to adapt or die, and the knowledge that those markets sustained had to find new homes or vanish entirely. Hassan Abdullah closes his ledgers and extinguishes his lamp, ending another day in a business that's ending itself, maintaining traditions that are becoming memories, preserving knowledge that future generations will struggle to understand because they won't share the context that made that knowledge meaningful. The roses will still bloom each spring in the gardens around Agra, but fewer people will know how to harvest them properly, how to dry them perfectly, how to judge their quality with the precision that Hassan Abdullah devoted his career to mastering. And perhaps that's simply how things are meant to be. Knowledge serving the needs of its time, flourishing when conditions support it, fading when conditions change, leaving behind only traces of what once was extraordinary and ordinary simultaneously. The remarkable everyday expertise of people whose names history rarely records, but whose work made civilization's refinements possible.